True power is not about winning arguments, but mastering oneself and handling interactions strategically. Have you ever tried to convince someone using logical arguments, only to notice that instead of winning them over, they became even more resistant? This is a common problem. We argue believing that reason will prevail, but reality is different. The more we try to prove something, the more the other person distances themselves. In the end, no one wins. They just put in a lot of effort. Most arguments do not seek the truth, but rather feed the ego. People enter debates driven by a desire for validation, not a genuine interest in learning. This creates a toxic cycle. You argue, the other person objects, the conversation heats up, and the initial goal is lost. In the heat of the moment, we forget what truly matters. It is not the logic of the argument that counts, but how emotions shape the perception of reality. Inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy In Pursuit of Power, this video explores how silence can be applied in everyday life to transform how we interact with and influence others. Nietzsche did not see power as the ability to impose ideas by force, but as the ability to control oneself and thus influence others. Instead of reacting impulsively, the true strategist chooses when to speak and when to remain silent. This is what we will explore, how silence is often stronger than words. Arguing seems like the natural way to prove something, but the truth is that most heated conversations do not lead to real change. The reason is that the human brain is not programmed to accept arguments that challenge its beliefs. On the contrary, when someone feels their ideas are under attack, their instinct is to defend, not to think. This is due to what psychologists call confirmation bias. Instead of rationally analyzing new information, we tend to seek out evidence that reinforces what we already believe. In other words, the more you try to defeat someone in an argument, the more they entrench themselves in their own opinion. The result? Instead of convincing them, you create resistance. Another common mistake is confusing debate with social validation. Many people argue not because they want to learn something new, but because they want to prove they are right. When the goal is not knowledge, but the desire to come out on top, every conversation becomes a battle of egos. If you find yourself arguing just to reaffirm your position, you are falling into this very trap. Furthermore, emotional reactivity undermines any position. The moment you lose control and start reacting impulsively, you have already lost. The person who reacts is manipulated by their environment, while the one who remains silent controls the dynamic of the conversation. Most arguments are not about logic but about presence and posture. Nietzsche argued that true power does not lie in reacting to every provocation, but in controlling one's own reactions. This brings us to our next point: how the philosophy of strategic silence can transform your influence in any situation. Nietzsche understood power differently from most people. For him, true power did not reside in brute force or the imposition of ideas, but in the ability to influence reality without being a slave to one's emotions. His concept of the will to power was not just about dominating others, but above all, about mastering oneself. At the center of this thought stands the figure of the Übermensch, the superhuman who transcends instinctive reactions and acts strategically. He does not get irritated by provocations, does not disguise his strength to prove something, and does not react automatically to external stimuli. He observes, reflects, and chooses when and how to speak. This idea is directly related to the power of strategic silence. For Nietzsche, silence was not synonymous with passivity, but a powerful instrument of control. Those who master silence command respect without needing to assert themselves. Instead of falling into the trap of emotional debates, they create tension and force the other person to reveal themselves. Silence has a profound psychological effect. When someone expects a response but is met with only a pause, uncertainty begins to weaken their confidence. The human mind hates emptiness, and in the face of silence, it fills that space with doubts and interpretations. This is the secret of strategic silence. Instead of reacting to every provocation, you allow the other person to get lost in their own insecurity. Nietzsche believed that most people were prisoners of their emotions and that true strength lay in controlling automatic responses. In his own words, those who cannot control themselves will always be controlled by someone else. In the real world, we see this principle applied by leaders, strategists, and influencers who know that saying less is often the way to gain more. The idea that silence can be a tool of power is not just theoretical. It has been applied by some of history's greatest minds. From philosophers to business strategists to legendary warriors, many influential figures have used silence to control interactions and win battles without raising their voices. Did Socrates ever need to prove he was right? He simply asked questions. His method, known as the Socratic method, was a dialectical game of questions and answers, followed by more questions. He listened, asked, and let his opponent contradict themselves. This process, in addition to avoiding direct confrontation, made people feel responsible for changing their own minds, making learning much more effective. This strategy is still used by great teachers and leaders. Instead of trying to convince someone directly, they ask strategic questions that lead the other person to see flaws in their own logic. This not only diffuses conflicts, but also helps people draw their own conclusions, which is far more effective than simply telling them what to think. Steve Jobs was not a man of many words. He knew that in negotiations and presentations, silence was his best weapon. When he wanted his team or partners to make a decision, he paused and waited. The discomfort of silence forced others to fill the space, often aligning with the idea Jobs wanted to impose. Strategic silence created tension and anticipation. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight. He mastered the rhythm of conversations, using calculated pauses to make his audience reflect. This skill not only helped him build Apple, but also made him one of the most influential figures in the business world. The legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi understood that a battle began long before the first sword was drawn. He used silence to unnerve his opponents. When challenged to a duel, he often arrived late on purpose, forcing his opponent to wait and waste energy in anxiety. This psychological game shattered his opponent's confidence before the fight even began. Musashi also adopted a minimalist combat style, never wasting energy on unnecessary attacks. Instead, he studied his enemy's movements, waited for an opening, and struck at the precise moment. His absolute self-control made him one of the greatest warriors in history. The principle behind these stories is clear. The one who controls silence controls the situation. In debates, negotiations, or even battles, the person who stays calm and uses strategic pauses gains the upper hand. Now, I invite you to a challenge. In your next discussion or difficult conversation, try using strategic silence. Wait, observe, take your time. See how it changes the dynamic. And if you have ever used this strategy or want to share your experiences, leave a comment.